You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Shopping for pants can be hard. You have to find the right size, the right color, the right vibe. And then you have to buy a bunch of different kinds of pants for different things. Work pants, weekend pants, travel pants, chill pants, so many pants. But what if there was one kind of pants and that's all you needed? Instead of needing different pants for work, travel, and weekends, the Jetsetter Tech Pant is designed to do more with one pair. Built for the office, golf course, date nights, and everything in between. I ordered some of these pants, and I simply did not select the right size. But the return process was super easy. Took maybe 5 minutes to get the return going, and most importantly, when I put in what was happening, they made suggestions for what I should pick differently. It turns out I'm just a bit rounder than I expected. In just a few days, my replacements arrived, and finally, I can wear pants again. Right now, Jack Archer is offering our listeners 15% off your first order with promo code GETJACK. Go to jackarcher.com and use promo code GETJACK for 15% off your first order and see why thousands of people have given the Jetsetter Tech Pant 5 stars. That's jackarcher.com, promo code GETJACK for 15% off your first order.
This episode is brought to you by Accenture. When your advertising operations fall out of sync, everything else follows. Spotify and Accenture are working together to reinvent the rhythm of ad sales, using automation, analytics, and smarter workflows to simplify campaign delivery and access better data across the business. The result? Less time spent on operations, more time connecting brands with the moments and fandoms that matter most. Learn more at accenture.com/Spotify.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 266, War at Sea 41 Part 4, The End of Operation Berlin. This week, a big thank you goes out to Charlie and Mario for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. Operation Berlin had started with the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau breaking out into the Atlantic through the Denmark Strait, meeting up with their supply ships, and then making their way into the convoy routes. Then the first convoy was encountered, HX-106, and it would be the perfect example of the challenges experienced by the Germans during their attempts at commerce raiding with their cruisers and battleships. It took several days to find the convoy, and then when they did, the presence of a large convoy escort, the old battleship HMS Ramillies, forced Admiral Lütjens to make a choice. Engaging the Ramillies brought with it serious risk, as any damage could be fatal in the wide expanse of the Atlantic. But not engaging the Ramillies would mean that all of the work that was put into finding HX-106 would have been wasted. Lütjens would choose the more cautious approach and would not engage the Ramillies, and instead the German battleships would make their way back to their supply ships to replenish their fuel for another adventure into the convoy routes. This would be far from the last time that the German ships would encounter British battleships and have to make a decision about whether or not to risk their ships in combat. It would be an interesting show of both weakness and strength from the Royal Navy. The fact that the German ships could get into the Atlantic at all said something about how the Royal Navy was being stretched to try and address all of the commitments it had in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. While at the same time, it was still able to be in position and position its strength in such a way to thwart multiple different convoy attacks during Operation Berlin. The Royal Navy could not do what it wanted to do, take an aggressive stance against the German battleships, but it could do what it needed to do, which was protect the convoys, at least mostly. After another period with his supply ships, Lütjens began to head out once again. He had information about another HX convoy that had left Halifax, just like HX-106 that he had encountered before, but due to when it left Halifax, the expectation was that he would have to move a little further to the west. The challenge during this search was the weather, which made it difficult to find anything because the primary way to spot merchant ships was through simply seeing them on the horizon. The weather cut down visibility, which just made it unlikely that anything would be found. However, they did get lucky on February 22nd when a ship appeared on radar. This would prove to be a handful of ships that were on their way back to Canada after having delivered their goods to Britain days before. It was general practice for convoys to break up when they got close to the coast of North America, and largely outside the zone of U-boat operations at this point in the war. And at that point, they split up so that they could make their way back to their home ports to usually get more stuff to take back to Britain. These ships were pieces of a convoy that was doing just that. They were just breaking up at this time. After initially spotting the ships early in the morning, the 2 German battleships would spend most of the day hunting down their prey, with a total of 5 merchant ships destroyed, 3 by the Gneisenau and 2 by the Scharnhorst. The total tonnage of the 5 ships was around 26,000 tons. It was a good number for a day's work by the battleships, and after it was done, Lutjkins would head south, instead of back north, to meet up with another set of pre-positioned support ships which were positioned in the Saragossa Sea area, an area that was generally free of merchant and military ships, so it made for a safe area for the German ships to meet up. After meeting up with the supply ships for another topping up, Lutjkins planned on moving in a different direction than what he had done before, moving off the HX convoy route out of Halifax and onto the routes between West Africa and Britain. The best area to work in was controlled a bit by the presence of the Royal Navy at Gibraltar, with Force H being based there and presenting a real risk to the German ships. But there were several real advantages to the new area of operations. The first was that simply it was different, which Lutjkins hoped would throw the British off a bit. It was also an area where it was more likely that the convoys would be sticking together rather than being at a boundary where the convoys started breaking up like the previous area of operation in the north against the HX convoys. While their previous position had contributed to a few of the merchantmen that they had been able to sink, it also made it difficult to come upon a full convoy, since most ships that the Germans attacked got off contact reports via radio. And the dream of every German admiral, every German captain, everybody on board these German ships was to find an unprotected, intact convoy to just run riot inside of. And instead of picking off 5 or 6 or 3 or 4 merchant ships, it would be 20 or 30 or some extreme number. That was always the goal. So intact convoys were kind of the grand prize that they were always looking for. Another benefit of being further to the south is that simply the weather would be better, with fewer storms that would test the seaworthiness of the ships, which had already proven to have some issues. Another benefit of the weather is that it might allow the Germans to use the float planes that they had brought with them. One of the major features of capital ships during the interwar years was the introduction of hangars that could operate float planes, which were useful for scouting as well as spotting the fall of shells during engagements. That was most of the reason they were initially put on battleships, was to act as spotting agents. But by this point, that was probably less useful, and scouting was their real utility. However, to launch and recover the aircraft, the weather had to be within a relatively narrow band of wind and sea conditions. On March 3rd, when it was time to use the planes, the seas had been too high. And then on the 4th, the Gneisenau's aircraft had damaged itself while landing. While these issues were frustrating, they paled in comparison to the general frustration that the Germans would experience during the first 5 days of March. They would essentially just wander around, trying to find something to attack with absolutely no success. By darkness on the 5th, the estimates were that they had searched 30,000 square miles, 78,000 square kilometers of ocean, and they had found nothing. All of this moving around was drawing down fuel supplies and meant that they would soon have to abandon the search for another trip to a rendezvous with their tankers. There would also be a message that would be delivered to Lutjkins via radio, which included a contact report of heavy military ships that had been radioed in by a U-boat. This would have been a concern. Oh my goodness, Royal Navy, heavy ships in the area. Except for the fact that the report gave the position of the heavy ships as exactly the positions of the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Up to this point, nobody had done the work to give the U-boats and the surface ships an easy way to communicate at sea, and so the only thing that could be done was to notify the groups ashore about the situation and hope for the best. Hopefully that U-boat wouldn't launch an attack on the heavy military vessels that they apparently had spotted. During all of this, there was one real problem with the weather that had to be considered, and that was a problem of heat. The German ships were not designed to work in tropical waters, with the design assumptions being made that they would be working in northern waters, the North Sea, the North Atlantic, the Arctic Ocean, which I'm sure caused the men to be a bit sweatier than they wanted as they got closer to the equator. But more worrying was the fact that the cooling system in the magazines would flirt with dangerous temperatures to the point where there were moments of concern that the explosives might start cooking off and cause the ships extreme damage.
The right window treatments change everything. Your sleep, your privacy, the way every room looks and feels. At Blinds.com, we've spent 30 years making it surprisingly simple to get exactly what your home needs. We've covered over 25 million windows and have 50,000 five-star reviews to prove we deliver. Whether you DIY it or want a pro to handle everything from measure to install, we have you covered. Real design professionals, free samples, zero pressure. Right now, get up to 40% off site-wide, plus get a free professional measure at Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions apply.
When the world keeps shifting, we're there to help you act with confidence. At HSBC, we bring together the people, ideas, and capital that drive growth, backing your ambitions at every stage. So when you're preparing for the next generation, strengthening your portfolio, or you're entering new markets, we're there, bringing 160 years of experience to help you move forward. HSBC, opening up a world of opportunity.
Even with the problems that they were experiencing, there would be good news that would arrive on the morning of March 7th, when messages arrived with information about SL-67, a northbound convoy that the German ships should be in position to intercept. SL convoys were convoys that traveled from Sierra Leone to British ports. However, as the German ships moved into a position to intercept, the same problem as before occurred once again. A bit before 10 a.m., lookouts on the Scharnhorst spotted the upper works of an enemy battleship. At around 10:30 in the morning, they spotted a Swordfish floatplane, which was a problem because there were only two types of ships known to use Swordfish floatplanes: British cruisers and British battleships. In this case, it was the battleship Malaya, which was of the Queen Elizabeth class, and it was also joined by two destroyers. The floatplane would report sighting the two German battleships, and this allowed the British warships to move into position in between the Germans and the convoy. Once again, Lütjens was presented with the choice of engaging the heavy British ship or breaking contact, and for the second time he would choose to break contact. It was another frustrating end to the hunt. It had taken a month to find another convoy, and once again, they had to turn away due to a convoy escort. With another intercept thwarted, the German ships took another few days to take a break to meet up with their supply ships. While this was happening, a message arrived that would impact the position of the two ships in the weeks ahead. They were ordered to move further to the west and to attack convoys in those areas, which would pull the strength of the Royal Navy to the west as well. The goal of these orders was to clear a way for the return of the Admiral Hipper and the Admiral Scheer, which were on their way back to Germany after their own surface raiding expeditions. The rough estimate for their return was the second half of March, and so the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau needed to be in position and causing issues for the Royal Navy by that point. Along with this information, Lütjens also received the orders to put into port near the beginning of April, but not in Germany, but instead the French port of Brest. This was due to the planning for the end of April that was already kind of underway. At that time, the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen would be ready to cruise out into the Atlantic as well, and the goal, which would never occur, was for those two ships to join the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in the Atlantic at that time, overwhelming the attempts of the Royal Navy to protect the convoys. However, to meet those dates, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had to be in Brest at the beginning of April so that they could begin their refit and resupply process before they were sent out again near the end of April. The news that he would soon bring his ships into port was welcomed by Lütjens because there were a growing number of issues that needed to be resolved in port. Aboard the Gneisenau, there were multiple systems that were no longer completely functional, with some auxiliary systems only being available in emergency situations. On the Scharnhorst, the issues were with the steam lines, and that meant that they could not reach maximum power. All of these problems were fixable, but only in port, and hopefully they could be quickly fixed at Brest in time for future operations. But before that could happen, there was one further hunt that needed to take place, and therefore after the resupply operations were completed on March 12th, that hunt would begin. From the very beginning, one of the challenges for Lutjkins was the fact that he only had 2 ships, and this limited the amount of ocean that he could search. Essentially, due to the curvature of the Earth, the radar and the men aboard the German battleships could only see so far. To try and help solve this problem, Lutjkins would enlist the help of the 2 supply ships, and they would come along with the German warships to extend the range of their search. The 4 ships would each be positioned so that a ship could not pass between them unnoticed, and that would allow them to cover 50 miles or more, 80 kilometers or more of ocean in one single pass. And through this process, they would spend most of March 15th picking off small groups of merchant ships that they were able to spot. First, it was 2 British tankers, then a few hours later, 1 tanker and 3 cargo ships, then a few hours later, another group, and that's just kind of how things went along. In total, 6 ships were sunk and 3 were captured. Not for the first time, the Germans had been the beneficiaries of the fact that the convoys had been broken up when out of prime U-boat hunting grounds, and so they were completely unprotected from the attack by German surface raiders. After a very successful day on March 15th, on the 16th, there was hope that their luck would continue on that day, and in some ways it did. There would be another group of ships that would be found and would be sunk. However, the biggest prize was the convoy HX-114. But there was a problem, and that problem was once again another British battleship. In this case, it was the HMS Rodney with its 16-inch guns. The Rodney was old. The Rodney was very slow. But those 16-inch guns were nothing to scoff at. It had been escorting HX-114, but then as reports of the attacks on merchant ships piled up, the Rodney moved in to investigate the situation. This would result in the Rodney and the Gneisenau approaching to within 17,000 meters or 19,000 yards, which was well within the engagement ranges of both the British and German ships. However, the Rodney did not know exactly what ship it was looking at, and so instead of just opening fire, it sent a challenge signal, which the Gneisenau answered as the HMS Emerald, a cruiser. The bit of confusion caused by this signal allowed the Gneisenau time to turn around and run away very quickly, at a much greater speed than the Rodney could match. With another hunting spree interrupted, the decision was made that it was time for the German battleships to make their way to Brest. They would meet up with supply ships once again to top off their tanks before starting on their way east. There would be one final bit of drama before the ships arrived in the French port, because on March 20th, they would be spotted by aircraft that had been launched by the Royal Navy carrier HMS Ark Royal. These air patrols were put in place specifically to catch any German surface ships or surfaced U-boats on their way to the French ports on the Bay of Biscay, and in this case, they were completely successful. All that Lutjkins could do was order his ships to make best possible speed towards the French coast, which started a race between how quickly the British carriers could launch a strike and how quickly the German ships could come under the cover of the Luftwaffe. At dawn on the 21st, in preparation for a strike, the Ark Royal sent up search planes, but they simply got unlucky and were unable to verify the location of the German ships. That miss would allow enough time for the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau to reach the protection of shore-based Luftwaffe fighters, which would protect them all the way into Brest on the 22nd of March. Just before 8 a.m., they would lay anchor in the port with their crews of 18,000 miles, 29,000 kilometers, over. While Operation Berlin had not been a perfect success, it had still been a success. In some ways, it had validated the German approach to surface raiding, with the battleships being able to operate relatively freely in the commerce lanes and sink and capture 22 merchant vessels with a total tonnage of just over 115,000 tons. And Raider would send a signal along these lines, congratulating the 2 ships on their accomplishments. Quote, "On completion of the first occasion in German naval history in which a squadron of our battleships has operated successfully in the wide spaces of the Atlantic, I congratulate you and your subordinates on the fine resolution you have shown and the splendid results you have achieved. I appreciate the vital part played by supply ships and escorts, which also receive my fullest praise. I hope before long to be able to put an even stronger force under your command for a similar operation on the high seas." End quote. That last sentence is in reference to the future plans for operations with Bismarck. But while their efforts were worthy of praise, there were successes there. There were also some very worrying pieces of the Operation Berlin story that, in hindsight, go a long way to explain why it would be the last major success for the German surface raiders. Movement of British battleships into the convoy lanes created a serious problem that could not be easily solved, and any German attempt to brute force the issue by engaging them would greatly increase the risk to the German ships. The Germans also did not have an answer to air power, and while there had not been any major issues with aircraft during Operation Berlin, even the random spotter aircraft of various warships made approaching convoys very risky. The hope for Raider and the Kriegsmarine is that simply getting more guns out into the Atlantic was the answer, to try and spread the Royal Navy even thinner. But for that to happen, they needed all of their ships in fighting shape at the same time, and the Royal Air Force was about to do everything in its power to prevent that from happening. Throughout the war, there was often friction between the RAF and the Royal Navy around how resources were allocated and where the focus should be for British industrial production. But during the last days of March and the first 2 weeks of April 1941, the Royal Air Force would be called upon to solve a major problem for the Royal Navy, and they would deliver. The entire problem with using Brest as a port for German warships was that it was well within the range of British aircraft, not just their heavy bombers that could reach into Germany if they wanted to, but also lighter, faster aircraft. This meant that as soon as the RAF confirmed that the 2 German ships were in Brest, which they did on March 28th through the use of photo reconnaissance flights, the bombing raids were almost inevitable. The first 2 large raids were nighttime bombing raids with around 100 heavy bombers on the night of March 31st and then again on April 4th. This would cause enough concern that the Gneisenau was going to be moved into a more protected dry dock, but then an unexploded bomb was discovered in the dry dock, which delayed entry. The Gneisenau was therefore just moored in the harbor, where on April 6th, one of 4 Bristol Beauforts would be able to drop a torpedo which would hit the stern of the Gneisenau. The Beaufort pilot was Flying Officer Kenneth Campbell, and it was crewed by James Scott, Ralph Hillman, and William Mullis, and the aircraft would be destroyed before their torpedo struck the German vessel. Their sacrifice and their service to the war effort would be immortalized by the award of a Victoria Cross. Their torpedo caused the Gneisenau's propeller shaft to buckle and severely damaged its propulsive and electrical systems. It would take months to repair it. This single torpedo, dropped by Flying Officer Kenneth Campbell and his crew, would destroy the plans for the great German naval operation that was to follow. And along with the issues with the Scharnhorst, it meant that the Bismarck would be the only heavy ship available for the spring of 1941. A few nights later, another large heavy bomber raid would arrive. While the Gneisenau was in dry dock, 4 bombs would hit the ship, with the 4 500-pound or 230-kilo bombs causing heavy damage. The answer to these problems was to simply increase anti-aircraft defenses at Brest, with 34 heavy and 22 light anti-aircraft batteries eventually being brought in. This was combined with plans for massive smoke screens to be laid down, with the goal of covering an area of 3 miles by 7 miles, that's 5 kilometers by 11 kilometers, with a smoke screen that could be set up in 15 minutes, and it would last 6 hours if there wasn't very much wind. This would make it almost impossible for the British bombers to properly aim their bombs, with the goal of making it impossible to hit anything. Work also began on a series of decoy ships, with large, old French naval ships brought into the harbor where fake superstructures were placed on them so that they could act as decoys, at least against air attack. But in a lot of ways, the damage had already been done by this point. The Gneisenau would continue to be repaired along with the Scharnhorst, and Raeder would elect to not wait for those repairs to be completed before launching his next operation. That next operation will not begin next episode, and instead we will take a short break from the surface raiding discussions to discuss the other major area of Kriegsmarine operations, the U-boats. The U-boats had some ups and downs during 1939 and early 1940. Early 1941 would be another interesting moment for the U-boat fleet, as the spring months started off well, but then the losses of some of their great early war captains would set up the U-boats for a very challenging summer in 1941.